I remember sitting in my doctor's office, filling out one of those checkbox questionnaires. You know the one. In the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt little interest or pleasure in doing things? In the past 2 weeks, how often have you felt down, depressed, or hopeless? 2 weeks. I remember sitting there with the pen hovering over those checkboxes, thinking, this doesn't even scratch the surface of what's wrong with me. 2 weeks? My system has been running survival code for years. 2 weeks is not a snapshot of my mental health. It's a snapshot of how good I'd gotten at functioning through it. But I didn't have that language, and he didn't have another box for me to check. This is The Spiral with Lauren Tobey, the science of stress, burnout, identity, and why you feel the way you feel. This is for the woman who's done everything right and still doesn't feel like herself. Here, we finally figure out why. Welcome to the podcast. When he told me I was maxed out on my medication and should consider additional talk therapy, I knew something wasn't right. The framework being used to describe me was all wrong. Because I wasn't just depressed. I wasn't just anxious. My nervous system had been operating under sustained threat for so long that my body had adapted in ways a 2-week questionnaire was never designed to measure. The tremors, the insomnia, the bone-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep touched, the jaw tension, the irritation that flared from nowhere, the flat, numb, going through the motions feeling that had settled in so gradually, I thought it was just what life felt like now. None of that showed up in the boxes because the check boxes were measuring symptoms. My body was living inside a system. And the labels I kept collecting, depression, anxiety, maybe ADHD, maybe something else, they weren't wrong exactly, but they were incomplete. They described what my nervous system was producing without ever asking what my nervous system was responding to, without ever connecting the dots between what I carried and what my body was doing with it. I've learned since then that my experience is not rare. It might be one of the most common experiences women have inside the mental health system. Millions of women are walking around with a label that doesn't actually explain what's happening in their nervous systems. And when the label doesn't fully land, when the medication helps a little, but never fully, when therapy is giving them a language, but the patterns keep running, most women come to the same conclusion. I must be the broken variable. But today I want to talk to you about something I've been thinking for a long time. Why trauma and neurodivergence are not two separate conversations. Why they overlap at the level of the nervous system in ways the diagnostic system was never built to capture. And why the women collecting diagnoses without feeling understood isn't broken. She's being described by a system that doesn't have the language for what's actually going on. Let me give you a piece of information that changed how I see the entire mental health landscape. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the rule book that American mental health professionals use to decide what counts as a real condition, what gets a diagnosis code, what insurance will pay for, what ends up getting research funding, what medical schools end up teaching about, what doctors are trained to recognize. Complex PTSD is not in any version of the DSM. No diagnosis, no code, no criteria, no pathway, nothing. A condition estimated to affect 25 million Americans has no diagnostic code in the book that governs how American mental health operates. Now, the World Health Organization recognized complex PTSD years ago in the ICD-11, the international version, gave it its own category, its own definition, its own set of criteria. But the American DSM committee, which met after the international committee, still chose not to include it. And it matters more than people think because if it's not in the DSM, doctors can't bill for it. Insurance won't reimburse for it. Hospitals can't code it. Medical schools barely mention it. Providers aren't trained to recognize it. The science has been there for over 30 years. Judith Herman proposed it in 1992. Bessel van der Kolk has spent decades documenting how prolonged trauma reshapes the brain differently than single incident trauma. The research exists. The diagnostic manual just hasn't caught up. So instead of hearing, this is a result of prolonged trauma, we get the diagnoses the system knows how to bill for. Depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, borderline personality. All of these are separate labels, each one treatable in isolation, each one manageable with medication and a few coping skills. Never mind that the underlying engine is still running survival code. No one bothered to name that. And if this is starting to make you angry, hold on. I'm about to make you madder. What happened between 2018 and 2025, do you ask? We lived through a global trauma event. People were trapped in unsafe homes, isolated from their support systems, overloaded with caregiving, fear, instability, constant stress. People stuck with partners who were already harmful and forced to be around them nonstop. People losing jobs, businesses, relationships, all at once. And instead of naming the trauma that was, it was labeled a depression epidemic. Millions of nervous systems were pushed past their limits, but because the DSM didn't recognize complex PTSD, the entire country misread the symptoms. The system treats what it can see and what it can bill for. Now we're going to layer neurodivergence on top of that. ADHD and trauma affect the same brain systems, the same regions, the prefrontal cortex, which is executive functioning, attention regulation, emotional regulation, right? But when your nervous system has been in survival mode, blood flow literally shifts away from the prefrontal cortex towards your survival centers, your thinking brain, the part responsible for focus, planning, impulse control, emotional regulation. All of that gets taken offline because something overwhelmed you. Now tell me, when a woman shows up in a clinician's office and she can't focus, can't regulate her emotions, can't follow through on plans, can't sit still, can't stop scanning the room for threats, what do they say? ADHD. And maybe that's accurate. Maybe she does have ADHD. But maybe what she has is a nervous system that's been running on emergency reserves for so long that her prefrontal cortex hasn't had the resources to do its job in years. Maybe what looks like inattention is dissociation. Maybe what looks like hyperactivity is hypervigilance. Maybe what looks like impulsivity is a body that learned to act before thinking because pausing to evaluate consequences feels unsafe. Research consistently shows that PTSD and ADHD share more similarities than differences. Difficulty with focus and concentration, hyperarousal, emotional dysregulation, executive dysfunction, sensory processing difficulties. The overlaps aren't subtle, it's extensive, which makes the risk of misdiagnosis high. Lately, we've been seeing an overwhelming influx of late-stage ADHD diagnoses. Women who are getting diagnosed in their 30s and 40s, men who are getting diagnosed into their 50s. But I want to challenge you to take a step back and think, okay, in the last 10 years, we've had this overwhelming diagnosis of late-stage ADHD, but those symptoms line up pretty closely to complex PTSD. So when you're looking at someone who's 30, 40 years old, is it more likely that a diagnosis was missed for 40 years, or is it more likely that they've experienced some complex trauma in those 40 years that has now adjusted the way their brain thinks? Now, I'm not saying that ADHD isn't a real diagnosis. It is. You can see it on brain scans. But how many of these people getting late diagnoses are getting the actual brain scan to obtain the true diagnosis? And for the woman who has both, who is carrying genuine neurodivergent wiring and genuine trauma, the picture doesn't just get complicated. It gets almost invisible because nobody's holding both lenses up at the same time. And the same is true for autism. People with autism are significantly more likely to experience adverse childhood experience, more than twice as likely, according to recent research, right? Masking, which is suppression of autistic traits to fit into a neurotypical environment, develops as a survival response. It's not just a social expectation. It's a response to trauma, to bullying, to social exclusion, to the lived, repeated experience that being yourself carries consequences. And for women specifically, masking works. It works devastatingly well. Girls learn to read the room. They learn to study other people's behavior and then reproduce it. They learn to perform composure and ease and normalcy. They solve social situations intellectually, running calculations behind a polished surface. And because it works, because they look fine, because they're praised for being easy and steady and no trouble at all, they go decades without ever being identified. Then they get diagnosed with anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder, or they get the late ADHD diagnosis at 38, and it explains some things, but not everything. And they're left holding a partial picture, wondering why they still feel so fundamentally out of step with the world. The diagnostic system was not built to hold this complexity. It was built to categorize, to isolate symptoms, to assign codes that insurance can process. It puts a Band-Aid on a bullet hole and calls it care. And the woman who's tried therapy and medication and journaling and meditation and breath work and all the things and still can't figure out why nothing fully lands. She's not the problem. The framework is incomplete. But guess what? Your nervous system does not care about diagnostic categories. It does not organize itself by the DSM codes. It does not run one program for ADHD and then a different program for trauma response. Your nervous system cares about three things: keeping you alive, protecting you from what feels dangerous based on learned patterns, and regulating your energy so you don't burn out completely. And if your system has to sacrifice self-esteem, ambition, 5-year plans, whether people like you, it will do so without hesitation and without ever consulting you first. When resources get low, expensive functions like joy, creativity, and connection are the first to go. That's true whether what depleted those resources is trauma, neurodivergence, or both. Your body is essentially a prediction machine. Okay, it's not passively receiving information from the environment. It is actively generating expectations about what's going to happen based on what's happened before. So every moment it's asking, given my past experience, what's most likely to come next? Your mind tracks events and order, but your body just tracks sensation. That heat in your chest and the bracing in your shoulders and the static humming throughout your nerves. And when today's moment carries the same internal weather as past overwhelm, your body activates an old survival response automatically, not the memory that was stored away in neat little filing cabinets, just the physiology of the moment. That's why you can tell yourself, I'm fine, and your breath is still short and your chest is still tight. Your mind responds to the facts of the situation. Your body responds to the patterns. And when a neurodivergent nervous system, one that already has to process the world at a higher volume, meets a trauma history that's loaded the pattern library with threat, you get a body that is permanently braced, permanently scanning, permanently spending resources it doesn't have. So let me walk you through where these two things actually meet. Your body, in the moment you're living every day. Masking is a survival pattern. This is the big one. Whether a woman masks because she's autistic or learned early that being herself creates friction, or because she grew up in a home where being easy kept things steady, or her marriage taught her that needs get weaponized. Her nervous system learned that showing who she actually is costs too much. So she performed. And over time, she stopped experiencing that as a strategy and started experiencing it as who she was. The easy woman, the low maintenance woman, the woman everyone praises for being so capable and so steady and so put together. She didn't choose that identity. She had to adapt into it. Whether the adaptations came from neurodivergent wiring or relational trauma or the intersection of both, the cost is the same. She traded authenticity for safety, and she did it for so long that she forgot there was a trade happening at all. I didn't stop using my voice because I had nothing to say. If you've met me, that is never, ever true. But I stopped because it felt safer. And I called that quiet personality for a long time. A lot of women I talk to have a version of this, of I'm just easygoing, I'm just adaptable, I'm just not that opinionated. Those aren't personality traits. They're survival patterns that have been running so long, they start to feel like identity. Shutdown looks the same. Autistic burnout and trauma-induced shutdown present almost identically. Numbness, fog, executive function collapse, loss of skills that used to be available, the feeling of being emptied out or erased, the inability to make a decision about something as simple as what you want to eat for dinner. It's because your system has exceeded capacity, and it's doing the only thing it knows how to do: shut down expensive functions to conserve what's left. Autistic burnout has been described in research as lasting 3 months or more, with recovery taking months or even years, not days, not a weekend, months to years. It's frequently misdiagnosed as major depression, anxiety, or personality disorder. Is that starting to sound familiar? Because trauma-induced shutdown gets misdiagnosed in exactly the same way. The woman lying on the couch at 8 p.m., phone face down, kids finally asleep, unable to feel anything at all. That hollow, watching yourself from a distance feeling. Whether the overwhelm came from sensory overload or relational trauma or decades of masking through environments that were never designed for her brain, or all of it compounding at once, her body's doing the same thing. It's conserving, it's protecting, it's shutting down to survive. In the spiral framework, this is the ashes. And ashes don't ask for a diagnosis before it arrives. It doesn't wait for you to sort out which label applies to you. Your system doesn't distinguish between being overwhelmed by a sensory environment your brain was never wired for and being overwhelmed by a relational environment your nervous system was never safe in. It responds to the load, period. Hypervigilance looks the same too. The woman scanning every room she walks into, reading the micro-expressions, tracking the tone shifts, noticing who's uncomfortable before they know they're uncomfortable, adjusting herself in real time to manage the emotional climate around her. Is that a trauma response? Her body learned that unpredictability equals danger, so it never stopped monitoring. Or is that a neurodivergent nervous system, processing every sensory input at full volume with no filter, scanning not by choice but by wiring? Or is it both? Her body doesn't annotate the answer. It doesn't give her a footnote that says, this scan was brought to you by ADHD, right? Or this tension is courtesy of your childhood. It just stays braced. She just stays tired, and the world tells her she's too sensitive, as if that's a personality flaw and not a nervous system operating at maximum volume with no off switch. Women's nervous systems are, on average, wired for higher relational attunement. Evolutionarily, survival for women often depended on reading social cues accurately, maintaining relationships, and avoiding any kind of conflict that could turn dangerous. The system that kept women alive was one that monitored the environment constantly and had to adjust accordingly. It's not weakness, it's a feature, one that gets pathologized instead of just understood, especially when you start adding neurodivergent sensitivity on top of it, especially when you add trauma on top of that. Women get stressed and suddenly we're handed a pamphlet about managing anxiety and asked if we've tried yoga and meditation. And all of this, by the way, is presented to us with a straight face. Meanwhile, our nervous systems are turning stress into migraines and IBS and autoimmune flare-ups, chronic fatigue, insomnia, more shutdown. And our nervous systems are having to adapt to relational threat and sustained emotional labor. That's not a flaw in how women process stress. It's a feature that gets treated like a disorder. And then there's identity erosion, which looks the same. So whether she lost herself inside a family dynamic that required constant adaptation, or whether she spent decades performing neurotypicality until she forgot who she was underneath the mask, the result lands in the same place. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I like anymore. I'm going through the motions. Everyone that says I'm strong, I want to scream at. Identity gets erased through 1,000 small adaptations, through years of monitoring someone else's until your own moods become background noise, through decades of suppressing what doesn't fit until fitting becomes the only skill you actually have, through a lifetime of being praised for being easy until easy becomes the only version of you anyone knows. And then one day you're just standing in your kitchen and your kid asks what you want, and you realize you have no idea because those desires got trimmed out way back along the way and you never actually noticed it was gone. A late diagnosed woman with autism in her 40s often describes the same grief as a woman emerging from a controlling marriage. Who am I when I'm not performing? Who am I when I stop managing everyone else's experience? Who am I if I take off the mask? And what happens if there's no one underneath it? That grief is real, and it's the same grief because identity isn't recovered, it's constructed. And construction requires conditions that survival and masking just can't provide. It requires felt safety, the kind that can settle into your nervous system and allows it to stop scanning long enough for something else to be able to develop. It's the kind that creates space between stimulus and response. That space that lets you hear your own signals instead of constantly monitoring everything else for threat. And then we get started on the shame narrative, which sounds the same. You guessed it. We'd say it wasn't that bad, or what's wrong with me? Why can't I just function like everyone else? Everyone else seems to be able to handle this world fine. Before she has a name for it, she already has a verdict. I'm the problem. Whether the source is trauma she can't validate because nothing dramatic ever happened, or neurodivergence she doesn't yet know about because she's been performing her way around it for 3 decades, or some combination her doctor never once considered, the shame is indistinguishable. It all funnels to the same place. Something is fundamentally wrong with me, and the fact that I can't fix it proves how broken I am. Shame doesn't care where it came from. It just tightens the spiral. And when shame installs itself at the level of identity, every reaction becomes evidence. Every moment of disconnection just confirms the story even more. So every slip feels like proof that you're too much, too sensitive, too broken. Survival patterns don't come with footnotes explaining where they originated. It just adapts to stay alive. And now it's your job to figure out what your system actually needs, not to assign it the right label, but to orient it to the right state. I know some of you listening to this are probably thinking, okay, so I might have trauma, I might be neurodivergent, I might have both, and the system that's supposed to help me can't tell the difference. Now what? Here's what I want to offer you, and I want to be careful with this because I am not a clinician and I'm not going to pretend to be one. I'm not here to tell you what you do have or don't have. I'm not here to diagnose anything, but what I am here to do is name what the diagnostic system keeps missing. It doesn't matter what label you carry if you don't know what state your nervous system is in. A diagnosis tells you what. It doesn't tell you where, and where is what actually determines what's actually possible in any given moment. Think about it. You can have a perfectly accurate ADHD diagnosis and be in a state of nervous system shutdown where no ADHD strategy in the world is going to land because your prefrontal cortex is offline, not because of your ADHD, because your system has exceeded max capacity and it's in conservation mode. You can't reason your way out of shutdown, and you can't mindset your way out of it. The state determines what's available to you, not the label. You can have a therapist who understands your trauma deeply and still leave every session with brilliant insights that evaporate the moment you're triggered, because your nervous system stores and retrieves information differently depending on your physiological state. What you learn while calm is not accessible when you're activated. You're not forgetting the tools. You literally cannot access that learning from a different nervous system state. It's like the information is stored in a room that you can't enter right now because you're in survival mode. I had a professor in college who told us to chew a specific flavor of gum while we were studying, and only while we were studying. Then bring that same gum to the exam. Your body would remember the material better. And I never fully understood why that worked until I started learning more about the nervous system. Because your brain stores and retrieves information differently depending on your physiological state. It's called state-dependent learning. And it explains why you can study all night and know everything. But the second you get into that test room and your anxiety spikes, all of that information goes away. So if you're chewing the gum when you're calm and chewing the gum when you're activated, your body makes a bridge and a connection to those things you learned when calm. It's fascinating. The human body is just a miracle system, and it's working exactly how it's supposed to. So people need to stop telling you that your nervous system is broken, because this also explains why you can have a breakthrough in therapy on Tuesday and lose every bit of access to it by Friday morning when your kid is screaming and your ex is texting you and your body is back in survival mode. You literally cannot access that learning from a different nervous system state. This is what I mean when I say everyone else treats awareness as the finish line. You become aware, you get the diagnosis, you read the books, you understand the patterns. You can explain all of that to yourself perfectly, but nothing changes. Because when you're activated, that awareness disappears because you don't have the capacity in activation. It's just a more articulate version of stuff. The spiral framework asks a different question than the diagnostic system asked. Not what's wrong with you, but where are you right now and what does that state require? So if you're in the ashes, whether that's autistic burnout or trauma-induced shutdown, or both crashing into each other at once, the state needs recognition, not motivation, not a new productivity system, right? Recognition that your system has exceeded capacity and it needs permission to be where it is without you adding shame on top of it. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is wrong. Something has been endured. That's the ashes. And the ashes is not the state for forward planning, big decisions, or trying harder, right? It's the state for recognition. Anything else burns resources that you don't have. And I know what you're thinking because I thought it too. This is too small. This can't possibly matter. Everyone else seems to have their life together, and I'm over here just trying to acknowledge that I'm depleted. That doesn't feel like a plan. That doesn't look like action. It doesn't fit into a pretty 5-step process. That voice that's saying that belongs to the part of you that learned worth through achievement. The part that was trained to believe that progress only counts if it's visible, measurable, impressive. The part that dismisses rest because it doesn't produce immediate results. If you're in the Ember, you're catching first flickers. Maybe you read about ADHD in women and something clicks. Maybe you learned about masking and thought, that's my entire life. Maybe you found something that described your internal experience so precisely that it felt like being seen for the first time. That recognition matters. But recognition without nervous system readiness just becomes another research rabbit hole, another 3 screens open at 2 a.m. Just another way to understand your shutdown without actually coming out of it. If you're in the flame, you're starting to finally see the survival patterns for what they are. The people-pleasing that isn't really your personality. The independence that ended up looking like isolation, right? The parts of you that people admired most were the very things that began to fail you first. And that realization is uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be. Because the system that armored you for war is recognizing that the war is over, and the armor itself has become the injury. So whether those patterns were installed by trauma, by neurodivergent masking, by ADHD, or by some combination that no single clinician has ever held at the same time, the flame is where it all gets exposed. The woman in the flame doesn't need another label. She needs to understand what's happening isn't regression, it's recalibration. Her growing inability to keep performing what once kept her safe. is the system recognizing that the version of her built for survival no longer gets to run the show unquestioned. And if you're in the rise, you hold the complexity without needing to resolve it. You stop needing one clear answer. You can say, I have a nervous system that was shaped by both my wiring and my experience. Some of what I carry is how I was built. Some of it is what I survived. And I'm learning to navigate from the truth instead of waiting for someone to hand me the right label so I can finally give myself permission to take it seriously. So I want to get practical here for a minute because I know this is a lot. And I know the woman listening to this might be sitting in her car in the school pickup line right now, or folding laundry at 10 p.m., or lying in bed unable to sleep. And you're probably thinking, okay, what do I do with this information? First, stop waiting for the right diagnosis before you take your nervous system seriously. No matter what someone puts on your chart, your body is giving you data right now. The fatigue, the overwhelm, all of that through the shutdown, through the fog, all of that is data that doesn't require a label to be valid. Orientation to your state doesn't require a diagnosis. You don't need someone to tell you whether your executive dysfunction is ADHD or trauma before you can acknowledge that your system is tapped out and needs something different than what you've been giving it. Second, notice when research becomes, and I say this with so much love because I am the queen of this, the type A woman with a Wi-Fi connection and unresolved everything, turning information gathering into a full-time coping mechanism. There's a point where learning about your nervous system becomes a way to avoid feeling your nervous system. Reading about shutdown is a whole hell of a lot easier than coming out of it. So if you're 3 hours deep in an ADHD subreddit at 1 a.m., that's not research. That's regulation avoidance in a very sophisticated costume. And I'm not shaming you for it. I did it. It felt productive. I still catch myself. But the body is paying for what the brain is trying to call progress. Third, if you do pursue formal assessment, look for someone who does comprehensive evaluation, not a 15-minute checklist, not a provider who's going to hand you a questionnaire about the last 2 weeks and call it a diagnosis. Someone who truly asks and learns about your history, your childhood, your relationships, your body. Someone that understands that trauma and neurodivergence can coexist and complicate each other. Someone who won't rush to the first explanation that fits their billing codes. And someone who believes you when you describe your experience, even if it doesn't match what they learned in school. Fourth, hold complexity. Give yourself permission to not know yet. You are allowed to be a woman who has ADHD and childhood trauma. You're allowed to be a woman who has autism and spent 20 years in a relationship that eroded her identity. You're allowed to be a woman who doesn't know which parts are wiring and which parts are wounds, and is still taking her nervous system seriously while she figures it out. You can carry more than one truth at the same time. Because here's what most clinicians don't tell you. The woman whose neurodivergence brain made her more vulnerable to trauma, whose trauma made her neurodivergent traits harder to identify, whose masking is both autistic survival strategy and trauma response running simultaneously. That woman doesn't fit cleanly into either category, and she has been told her whole life to fit cleanly, to be one thing. The complexity of the situation isn't the problem. The demand for simplicity is the problem. Your nervous system is allowed to be complicated. Life is complicated. Your story has layers, and you don't owe anyone a neat explanation for why you are the way you are. So I want to leave you with this. The woman who has been called too sensitive, too emotional, too much, too intense, too reactive, too everything. The woman who was told she was anxious when it was her body adapting to the environment around her. That woman isn't and wasn't broken. She was just undescribed. Trauma response and neurodivergent traits are both neurosystem adaptations. Both are intelligent. Both make sense when you understand what the system was responding to. And both have been pathologized by a culture that rewards masking and punishes difference. A culture that hands women pamphlets about managing anxiety with a straight face. And a culture who simultaneously glorifies being different while punishing the same difference. But when you treat the symptoms without addressing the underlying nervous system, you're managing consequences. You're treating the smoke without ever putting out the fire. And that's why so many women cycle through treatments that help a little, but never fully land. It's not that the treatment's wrong, it's just that it's incomplete. That's what the spiral framework was built for. It doesn't replace your diagnosis, but it gives you a way to orient to what's happening in your body right now so you can stop adding shame to adaptation and start responding with accuracy. That's orientation, and it's available to you right now, whether you're diagnosed or undiagnosed, carrying one label or carrying 5, whether you've been seen clearly or have been missed entirely. If this episode describes something you've been living inside, my book goes deeper. Spiraling into Control walks through each state, what your system needs in each one, and why the returns aren't regression. The chapters on misdiagnosis and complex PTSD are some of the most highlighted in the entire book, because finally having language for what's been happening inside your body changes the trajectory. Because language gives you permission to stop blaming yourself for adaptations that kept you alive. The link to buy it's in the show notes. And if you don't know which state you're in right now, and you're sitting with everything I just said thinking, I need to figure out where I am before I can figure out what to do, that's exactly what the Spiral app was built for. It doesn't require a diagnosis. It doesn't require you to have all the answers. It's there to help you orient, find your state, and learn what tools work in which state. Because orientation is the starting line, and everything else builds from there. You are carrying something real, and it's time you were described accurately. Same terrain, different altitude. That's the spiral. And it doesn't require a diagnosis to start moving through it. It just requires you to stop blaming yourself long enough to look at what your body has been trying to tell you this whole time. This episode may be over, but our time together doesn't have to be. If this episode found you at the right time, share it with the woman you thought of while listening. That's how she finds it. And don't forget to follow and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. For the book, the community, and more, visit laurentobey.com/connect.